Hoarding disorder, separate from OCD, is when people are collecting and saving a large number of objects and items. We all have some sentimental attachment to different things. So a lot of things in my home that my daughter owned, or that my, gifts from my sister that are very precious to me. So we have that sentimental attachment. For someone with hoarding disorder, it's to a huge number of items of varying degrees of quality, and their attachment is very extreme, such that the clutter builds up in their home and they can no longer use the home. So the people in our hoarding treatment groups and our research programs, oftentimes they are sleeping on the couch for years, or people sitting up in a chair because there's no place on their bed, unable to walk around their home. And then, of course, it's really quite frightening from a health and safety perspective, because it really increases the risk of fire. There's just lots of paper. It just can go up in a tinder, and then it's really difficult for the fireys to get in. Oftentimes it's really blocked with all the clutter. So that's when it reaches the level of an actual clinical disorder, and it's really distressing and anxiety provoking for people with this disorder to throw things away.
I think most of us have seen the footage of I think it's an English couple, and the man collected newspapers that went, and eventually, wasn't there a dreadfully sad ending to that? Did some of it fall down?
I was thinking of a different possible English couple where there was not a sad ending, but his whole side of the room was filled with newspapers to the ceiling, and his wife's was perfectly clean and tidy. But yeah, there are quite sad endings to a lot of the stories when it's not addressed.
Just before we get on to the hoarders, Nadal, does that ritual when he plays. Now, is that OCD?
Yes, I can't speak to him personally since I haven't interviewed him myself. But yes, I mean, there's elements of superstitiousness in OCD where people will do little rituals and say, if I tapped a certain way on my keyboard and drink my coffee in a certain way, then my grandparents will stay safe today. Okay. And have a strong belief that if I don't do these things, bad things will happen. So there is definitely some crossover with the kinds of things we see. But there's also probably more normative kind of sports psychology, little rituals that get people into their game face. I'm not sure which one it is with him.
And both Lex and I are performers, and we are extremely, we have little habits. We are superstitious people in the main, and things that we do and don't do in a dressing room, and things that are forbidden. So we know about those superstitions. But getting back to hoarding, when does it go from being just clutter? Where's the line into becoming a disorder, or is it so obvious that I don't even need to ask?
No, it's a really good question, because lots of us have accumulations of clutter, and just like you said, lots of us have little rituals and little superstitious quirks, and everyone's allowed to have their own quirks and a bit of clutter. There's a normal spectrum. So when we see that it's driving family and friends away, people aren't able to have people over at all, and they become quite lonely and isolated. When we see that they're not able to work properly because they're not able to cook. So that's another thing that happens, is people can't cook healthy meals. They're having to eat takeaway because their stove is covered, or they might not even be able to use the toilet. That's when it's crossed a line where we know it's really taken over the person's life and they've lost control.
And Jessica, is there any indication, nature and nurture, are you born a hoarder or do you become a hoarder?
It's both. It's just somewhat of an unsatisfying answer, but there's a fair amount of research coming out that there is a genetic component to hoarding, and it does run in families. So a lot of times people who have hoarding problems report that their grandparents had lots of clutter, or their parents, or they grew up in a hoarded home. So there is this genetic contribution, but it's also sometimes when you grow up in that kind of home, you learn that you have to save everything, that it's sinful or wasteful to throw anything away ever. That, things that you don't learn how to organize things properly or how to put things away. So certainly that is a component that is more of an environmental factor. And some people also report, in studies that we've had, that they have traumatic events in their life. So this is kind of more than the environmental side as well, where they grew up in a really hard home, or they had early trauma, or they had something happen to them in midlife, a very upsetting or a difficult divorce or a death in the family. And that ever since then, they started really collecting and saving things that provided them feelings of comfort or safety. So it's an interaction, absolutely.
Are some of the psychological traits typical in hoarders, like age bias, depression, anxiety? Do those things, are they always evident?
There's very high rates of depression and anxiety in our hoarding clients, and so that makes it just that much harder.
So they're not happy hoarders at all, are they?
Yeah, but I mean, there's some people who hoard who don't have depression, but the majority have some type of anxiety or depression that makes it even more challenging. And it's not always clear whether the hoarding made them more depressed and isolated, or whether being depressed and isolated made them save everything and get more and more cluttered in their home.
Jessica, what about I'm finding this fascinating, I have to confess. Is there a crossover between OCD and being on the autism spectrum?
That's a really interesting kind of cutting edge question that we don't know the answer to fully. There are certainly rates of comorbidity, and in hoarding as well, what we're noticing is one of the core elements of autism is this difficulty reading other people's emotion and understanding other people's emotion. We call that social cognition. And some research that I'm doing with one of my PhD students now is looking at that and finding that in hoarding, there's high rates of autistic traits and high rates of having difficulty connecting to other people that looks very much like autism. So I don't think it's the case that everyone with hoarding is autistic at all, but there does seem to be some overlap.
I can only imagine what effect does hoarding disorder have on relationships. I mean, it must be really difficult.
Yes, it's incredibly challenging. And there has been some research showing that family members of people who hoard have huge levels of resentment and frustration and anxiety. And they're just really at their wits' ends oftentimes by the time they contact us, because sometimes the person who hoards doesn't really think of it as a problem or doesn't want to admit to it being a problem. And meanwhile, the family members are tearing their hair out trying to help the person, trying to intervene. And it creates a really negative, often dynamic, which is hard because, as I said, oftentimes these individuals are already quite lonely and isolated, and now they're in this huge conflict loop with their family. It makes them even more isolated. So kind of trying to educate the family and help them become involved in more constructive ways is really an important part of treatment.
Is it the kind of disorder where if you can spot it early enough and get to it soon enough, you can ameliorate it?
Yeah, that's another hot topic in hoarding research. So you might have to join our research team. Is like, can we prevent hoarding? Because certainly when we get to people, and a lot of older adults who are 60, 70, 80, but they actually report that they started hoarding in their teen years. They had these tendencies already. So what if we were able to get to these people when they were teenagers or when they were uni students or when they were younger adults and kind of address some of the biases and get them to practice discarding, and then we could deal with it before they have an entire home filled with junk. So I think that's definitely a new direction. We haven't yet developed a great prevention program, but we are working on it.
Are you saying that we don't think that this disorder is curable?
It's about a third of the people who do treatment end up reaching probably what you might consider cure. So we do have a good cognitive behavioral treatment. A third, as you can see, it's not amazing. We would love to be able to help 2/3 or 80% of people with hoarding. But the fact that we have a treatment that is much better than doing nothing, it's quite a chronic disease. So if you don't do anything, you will continue hoarding is what we see. But if you do cognitive behavioral treatment and you engage, and you learn skills about how to discard, how to tolerate your emotions, how to make decisions about objects, how to organize things, between 30 to 40% of people who do that treatment at the end of the treatment are no longer classified as hoarding. So that to me is as close as we get to a cure in psychology.
And Jessica, just on a personal level, if you're at a restaurant and you see somebody continually adjusting their cutlery or something, are you inclined to get up and give them a card and say, ring me in the morning?
I'm not that good of a self-promoter. I might notice, but I certainly wouldn't be passing my card along. And then it's kind of like Patricia was saying, certainly we all have little quirks and little things that are not getting in the way. But if someone's unable to eat their dinner because they're so busy adjusting, or, I've had clients who are walking around the table and they need to walk around the table and it becomes really embarrassing for them, then we're crossing back into disorder.
Gosh, it can kill you. I mean, hoarding really can kill. I mean,
it can.
And
absolutely.
It's dangerous. It's unclean, unsanitary. Do these kind of terms make much difference to a chronic hoarder? I mean, do they mean anything when you say that to them?
It's quite variable, but I'm glad that you acknowledge how absolutely profoundly serious it is. Sometimes even in the mental health community, people don't fully acknowledge the gravity of hoarding. The quality of life of people who hoard is similar to schizophrenia, which is a very serious mental illness. So it's extremely severe and it can kill you. And